Canton, 1841. It's a dark, still night. The air is heavy, and there's barely a hint of breeze. Nature itself seems to be waiting for the battle that is to come. You are a British soldier on board one of the ships moored near Canton. Spies have warned you that a massive Chinese surprise attack is coming tonight. Then the sound of war drums starts echoing out of the darkness, a steady pulse that makes the hairs on your neck stand up. Shadowy boats start appearing out of the gloom. Some burst into flames as small Chinese crews guide them towards the vulnerable fleet. Next to them are fishing boats filled with Chinese riflemen, sending a wall of lead your way. As you frantically return fire, a bullet barely misses your head and smashes into the ship's wood. With a lucky shot, you hit one of the soldiers steering a fishing boat. As he falls forward, the boat careens into a fire raft. Its panicked crew, many now on fire themselves, leap into the water. Just when you thought the situation couldn't get any worse, you hear the boom of artillery fire coming from Canton. A cannonball smashes into your ship, splinters flying everywhere. Your fleet's guns return fire, pounding the city in turn. The night is now lit up by burning flames, its former quietness punctured by gunfire, the screams of the wounded, and battle cries. You only know one thing for sure, that the battle for Canton has barely begun. I'm your host, James Barton. Welcome to Forgotten Wars.
This country is at war with Germany.
Today, our armed forces joined our NATO allies in airstrikes against Serbian forces.
Eagle 1, first strike, you have permission to engage the target.
In the first few hours after our servicemen went to the rescue of young Americans and of democracy in Grenada,
Damals uns ausgebildet. Wollen diese 4 Jahre nützen.
Hello everyone, welcome back. In the last episode, we saw the opening stages of the First Opium War as Britain inflicted a series of stunning defeats on Imperial forces. Now Canton itself is besieged as both sides plot their next move. Let's head to the front lines in southern China, where a deceptive calm hangs over the city. March 1841 was a weird time for all concerned in Canton. The city had been mired in recession as the anti-opium campaign cut off trade. Now suddenly the city was booming again as General Fang Wang allowed trade to restart. Record amounts of opium were pouring in while tea flowed out to the United Kingdom. Even the Chinese soldiers, officers and officials joined in to make their fortunes. It's really ironic that an army fighting to stop the opium trade was now trading opium itself. This war is filled with such hypocrisy. This brief period of calm and prosperity couldn't last, however. With his armies having been defeated, Fang had fallen back on their old standby of imperial officials, lying to the emperor. The Battle of the Bogue became a great Chinese victory, while reports of British ships near Canton were dismissed as mere opium smugglers who had easily been caught. Even a British attempt to negotiate was turned into a victory, with Fang reporting that, when 2 of their large warships, a steamer and a dozen sampans, tried to charge up the river, 100 of our unflinching cannon fired in unison. Having lost 2 ships and countless men, the English fled in terror, no longer daring to advance. The emperor was overjoyed at first, showering Fang with decorations and praising him as a military genius. However, he then noticed something odd. These great victories were occurring closer and closer to Canton. Why were the British still advancing if they were being constantly defeated? Even more perplexing was Fang's reluctance to inflict a final blow on the British. Surely they must be on their last legs. Already suspicious, when he found out trade had restarted, he threw a fit of anger worthy of his ancestors. Fang was replaced as commander, but allowed to stay in Canton to redeem himself. His replacement was Yishan, a cousin of the emperor and a grizzled veteran of the wars on China's frontiers. It was now that the imperial court finally got serious about this conflict. Before, it had been seen as more of a minor affair. Huge reinforcements were sent to Yishan, while a fortune in silver was made available from the depleted imperial budgets. With an army numbering 50,000 men, and the enthusiastic support of his local subjects, now was the time to crush these barbarians once and for all, decreed the emperor. Far from the Forbidden City, however, the situation didn't seem so clear-cut to those on the front lines in southern China. Canton was not united against the British. In fact, the city's supposed defenders all hated each other far more. The city's prosperity was dependent upon foreign trade. Many of the wealthy merchants wanted a British victory that would restart it and fill their pockets once again with silver. Their motto was, "It's not personal, it's just business." It was also hard to play the Chinese patriotism card when the emperor and his commanders were Manchus, who were themselves foreign occupiers, repressing the majority Han population. Locals had little loyalty towards a distant alien regime for which they felt at best apathy, at worst a burning hatred. Wise imperial commanders on the spot may have been able to win them over. However, Yishan and Wang seemed determined to antagonize the Cantonese as much as humanly possible. Troops from other regions were given special privileges and allowed to lord it over the locals, while troops from Canton were distrusted and given the worst assignments. General Fang even had a civilian beheaded on the spot for accidentally getting in the way of his litter. If that behaviour doesn't win over people, I don't know what will. A bitter Cantonese merchant summed up the local view of Yishan, claiming the only thing he was good for was buying watches and woolens, and giving or attending great banquets. All in all, Canton was about as united as Britain over Brexit or America over Trump. That said, Yishan knew his stuff at least. He came up with the idea of a huge surprise attack to drive the British into the sea. The money raised from reopening trade was spent on repairing fortifications, building secret artillery batteries, and creating a vast fleet of 200 fire rafts linked together by chains. Sadly for him, it was hard to keep these vast preparations secret from British spies. While the Emperor didn't help either. He kept sending regular public edicts calling on the Cantonese to back the so-called secret offensive when it started. Despite all this, his offensive scored some early successes. Until reinforcements arrived, the British were on the back foot and took the heaviest casualties in the war so far. In particular, the HMS Nemesis pounded the hidden artillery positions into submission, inflicting great damage on the city. The tide began to turn, literally, as some of the burning rafts floated back to Canton's harbour and set it ablaze. Next, the British deployed their secret weapon to take the remaining forts. Thousands of red-coated soldiers suffering from terrible dysentery. These poor men were soiling themselves non-stop. So badly, in fact, that some cut holes in the back of their trousers, all the while dodging bullets and fighting their way up hills towards the forts. Thankfully for them, the Chinese resistance quickly crumbled. Demonstrating that there is a silver lining for someone in most situations, an enterprising Chinese family made an absolute killing out of offering to clean the British soldiers' uniforms. While fighting well at the start, morale among the Chinese soldiers quickly collapsed when the offensive failed. The divisions between the Cantonese and the regiments from other provinces now took a tragic turn. The fleeing soldiers abandoned their positions and engaged in an orgy of looting and destruction, the likes of which Canton had never seen before. Come with me as we head through the streets of a city in chaos. They are coming. You can hear the screams, drunken shouts, and the sounds of destruction slowly coming closer. The soldiers who were meant to protect Canton from the barbarians are now sacking the city in an orgy of violence. To survive, you must brave the streets and escape from this new hell. The city you love has become a hellscape. Your wife gasps and clutches your baby to her chest. Smoke fills the streets from the burning docks. A Chinese soldier barges you out of the way as he runs past with a sack of looted goods. Everywhere, the soldiers are like locusts, stealing everything not nailed down. Dead bodies lie in the pavements. You hurry past, trying to remain unnoticed. As you turn a corner, you run into a soldier. He stinks of rice wine and carries a sword already covered in blood. He begins shouting. You can barely understand his strange dialect. He seems to be demanding money. You don't like the look in his eyes as he stares at your wife. He staggers towards you with a snarl on his face as you prepare to protect your family. You're saved by the arrival of another soldier who excitedly points to a merchant's warehouse, greed written all over his face. With a richer target on offer, they both run off. That was too close. Finally, you reach the safety of the city gates. Nothing now stood between the British and Canton. The very city that for centuries they'd been forbidden to even visit outside of the Golden Ghetto was within their grasp. Then suddenly, Elliot ordered the troops to halt. Yishan and Fang had agreed to capitulate to all his demands if he didn't assault the city. 6,000 British troops were left milling around in the sultry heat and moist atmosphere of the paddy fields of North Canton. If you've ever lived near a military base, then you know that bored soldiers can often lead to trouble. Angry at not being able to loot Canton, they plundered local villages and desecrated family tombs. Shamefully, a number of women were assaulted as well. The local villagers were determined to get revenge. 5,000 peasant fighters appeared before the British camp, armed with spears and shields and swords. They fled when a detachment was sent to chase them away. But then the heavens opened and a spectacular rainstorm occurred. So torrential was the rain, they obscured objects even a few yards away, while the soldiers' wet guns became useless. Most of the units made it back to camp, apart from one that seemed to have disappeared. Imagine this in your mind's eye. You are soaked to the bone. The woolen uniform you wear feels like it weighs a ton as it has absorbed so much water. Will this cursed rain ever stop? The Major is trying to work out how to get back to camp. The path has disappeared and the surrounding paddy fields have merged into one vast sheet of water. Everything looks the same. When you move your feet, water sloshes and you sink into the mud. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream comes from behind you. Turning around, you see the rearmost soldier has been run through with a spear, his surprised face staring down at the gaping wound in his chest before he tumbles over into the water. Behind him is a peasant, a look of hatred upon his face. Luckily, you have kept your powder dry for one shot, quickly raising your rifle and firing. You see his face explode into crimson. One of your comrades yells, "Major, look! There's thousands Thousands of them! Sloshing through the water of the paddies, armed villagers with grim faces surround your unit, poking with their spears as they search for a weakness. Forming a square, the unit frantically tries to clean your guns, fighting back against the spears of the peasants. All the while, the rain hammers down, half blinding you. They flee every so often when a musket shot is fired, but they always return for more. The situation is truly desperate. Is it your fate to die in the waters of this paddy field, far from home? A rescue mission was launched after a tiring trek through the waterlogged paddy fields. They found the missing unit still surrounded by local villagers. The peasants fled after being hit with a rifle barrage. They had killed 1 soldier and injured 15. The next day, 25,000 locals gathered outside the camp, threatening to overrun it. Ironically, the British were saved by Qing officials. The British general threatened to raze Canton to the ground if the villagers didn't retreat. In a move that would destroy his career forever, the local governor, Yu Baoqian, persuaded the locals to let the soldiers leave. Forever after, he would be tainted as a traitor. He would lose his position as governor and be forced to administer local civil service examinations. Every time they saw him, the students would throw their inkpots at him, denouncing him as a traitor. For the British, the events in the paddy fields had been a minor scuffle in the wider victory of reaching Canton. For China, however, it became a legend that even today school children are taught. Called the Sanyu Anli, after a local village, the tale became an instant sensation, a story that was embellished more and more every time it was told. Soon it was claimed 1,000 British had died at the patriotic villagers' hands, begging for mercy for their many crimes. It became China's Alamo or Dunkirk. While having no influence on the war, it answered a need deep in the Chinese soul, especially among the literate mandarins. The Imperial army had repeatedly been defeated, its soldiers often fleeing rather than fighting. They had even looted Canton, the city they were supposed to be defending. The less said about the Qing officials, the better. In these dismal circumstances, the peasants who stood up to the British, not once, but twice, seemed to show the way forward. It would be the ordinary Chinese who would drive out the foreigners and revive the country, not the decadent foreign Manchu Qing. Paramilitary groups and secret societies grew in popularity throughout the 19th century, leading to horrific losses of life in the Taiping and Boxer rebellions. Amazing how history can turn due to clashes in a waterlogged paddy field. This was in the future, however. For now, Yishan and Fang surrendered to the British demands. A massive £6 million ransom would be paid in silver, and trade allowed to restart. In exchange, there would be an end to hostilities in the Pearl River region, while Canton was not to be sacked. None of this had been authorized by Beijing, however, but the duo had a plan, and it involved the gullibility of the emperor. The Canton night attack suddenly became a huge Chinese victory, with the British fleet devastated and thousands of barbarians dead. There was not a single casualty on the Qing side either. Daoguang hadn't learned from past experiences and lapped it up, praising their military genius. To explain why they were allowing trade to restart if the British had been defeated, Yishan claimed that the following scene had happened outside the gates of the city. They came to beg the general to communicate sincerely to the great emperor that he should take mercy on them, permitting trade and ordering the Hong merchants to make good their debts. Then they would leave immediately and not make any more trouble. The £6 million ransom was disguised as the payment of debts by the traitorous Hong merchants. It was an ingenious story, and the emperor fell for it hook, line, and sinker. Mercifully forgiving the barbarians, Daoguang assumed the war was now over and ordered his forces demobilized. By this point, it does feel like his officials could have told him they were marching on London, and he would have believed it. Importantly, however, The duo hadn't told the Emperor that the truce only covered the Pearl River. The war wasn't over for the British. In their view, the Emperor didn't seem to care what they did on the Pearl River. So now they were heading north to attack the very heartland of China itself. The Imperial court was in for a very nasty surprise. So was Elliot. News finally arrived from Palmerston that he'd been replaced and should head home. Treated poorly on his return and having to fight for the moneys he was owed, eventually he was given an appointment to Texas. He hated it there, denouncing it as a den of villains, misery, murder, and mosquitoes. Apologies if I have any Texan listeners. With Elliot's departure, Britain's campaign in the First Opium War also changed. You may have noticed how the conflict has so far been very stop-start, and that was mainly due to Elliot. For all his faults, he didn't want to humiliate the Qing too much. A China that had a positive view of Britain would make a better trading partner. His was a long-term view of relations between the two empires. Now the short term would dominate. There would be no more delays. China would be opened kicking and screaming by the musket, the bayonet, and the cannon. The world is still recovering from this change. If Elliot was often condemned for being too pro-Chinese, the same can definitely not be said for his successor, Henry Pottinger. A tall man with an elegant moustache, he has spent most of his time in British India. He lived a life of daring-do, travelling in disguise, mapping the terrain, spying, and annexing the odd kingdom here and there. His time in India didn't make him any less hostile to the peoples of the East, however. He denounced Indians as avaricious, full of deceit, cruel, ungrateful, and strangers to veracity, while the local women were usually ugly. As for the Persians, he noted, good faith, generosity, and gratitude are alike unknown to them. Woke he certainly was not, but there were few better at doing the dirty work of the British Empire. As British ships headed north to continue the war, an anxious Yishan kept lying. Borrowing a line from Lin, he claimed they were merely opium merchants who'd gotten lost. The Emperor bought it, but his officials in charge of protecting the coast did not. They prepared for battle instead. It's about this time that the Emperor's edicts and orders are just getting ignored wholesale. First, the fleet headed towards Amoy, on the mainland, just across the straits from today's Taiwan. This really should have been an epic battle for the British. 1.5 million of Qing silver ounces had been spent on the defences, backed by 400 cannons and 15,000 soldiers. Yet defences are only as strong as the morale of the soldiers who defend them. As we will see, this had already plunged to zero. After a brief bombardment, British soldiers stormed the defences. They encountered Qing soldiers dressed in yellow uniforms with black spots and tiger head helmets, fully prepared for battle. While fearsomely dressed, they all fled after firing a few shots. Fort after fort, so expensively built and prepared, fell without any loss of life as the defenders hightailed it into the countryside. Let us head to one particularly bizarre incident. The sun shines down hotly, but here in the shade it is tolerable as you rest your head against the coolness of the cannon beside you. Like many of your comrades, you are smoking your opium pipe, the fumes of the poppy filling your lungs and your body with a nice buzz. You're meant to be defending this vital fort from the British, but there is no way they will get this far. Others can do the fighting while you relax. There hasn't even been any gunfire for a while. The barbarians have probably fled. Suddenly, through the open fort gate that some idiot forgot to close, one of the barbarians appears, shouting in their strange tongue, "Charge!" and firing his pistol. Seeing the 50 soldiers before him, he stops and stares, panting from the exertion. While you all stare back, completely dumbfounded that the barbarians have reached your position. The spell is broken as one of the Chinese soldiers drops his pipe and flees. Suddenly, you are all on your feet and running out the other side of the fort. As you turn back briefly, you see the same barbarian, still on his own, staring at you with a mystified expression on his face. That was how one British soldier captured an entire fort on his own. As at Canton, the fleeing soldiers engaged in an orgy of looting. The captain of the HMS Nemesis remarked in amazement that the only protection that locals had from the violence and plundering of their own rabble was from the presence of our own troops. One of the most prosperous ports in all of China had fallen with only 9 minor British casualties. The local governor is said to have burst into tears himself and fled when the British flag was raised. Amoy had just been a demonstration of strength, however. Now the fleet turned towards its true target, the island of Joseon. This island had already been conquered once before by the British, but it had been returned after Elliot and Kishan's deal. How long ago that already seems! Now aware that this was no opium fleet, the Emperor dispatched one of his best generals to defend the island. His name was Yi Che. On the face of it, he was a perfect combination of steppe warrior and Confucian scholar, something the Qing had been trying to achieve for the last 200 years. Well versed in the Chinese classics, he was also descended from steppe aristocracy and was related all the way back to the infamous Genghis Khan. Yet while he had been trained all his life on Confucianism, his military training had been neglected. It seems to have been assumed that it was all in the genes. As we will find out, that wasn't true at all. Yi Che started off strong. He blamed all the previous defeats on a lack of will, rather than the rot in the Chinese military or British technological superiority. Unsurprisingly, this was a line that pleased the Emperor, as it promised a quick fix to the problem, while assigning no blame to his government. Believing that it was all a question of will, Yi Che devoted himself to stiffening the spines of his troops and officials. Appearing before their mass ranks, he proclaimed that the nations of the West know nothing but material profit. They have no skill other than trade, no culture, law, or education. Nor does England have enough power to capture cities or seize territory in other countries. This would have come as something of a surprise to the same Western nations that were now partitioning the globe. It got worse when he unveiled his strategy for beating the British soldiers. We must fight them on land, for the enemy cannot use fists or swords. Moreover, their waist is stiff and their legs are straight. The latter, further bound with cloth, can scarcely stretch at will. Once fallen down, they cannot stand up again. Once again, the fixation with the tightness of British trousers. To demonstrate his will, Yi Che had 4 locals accused of working for the British beheaded. Then their heads were sent on a grisly tour of the island. It got even more gruesome when an English captain on an opium ship was taken prisoner. The captain had his arms and back flayed while he was still alive, and he was then sliced to death. His skin was fashioned into reins that Yi Che used for his horse. The Emperor loved this, boasting that he had finally found his man of steel. He would be disappointed, however. Rather than a great victory, China would suffer yet another horrific defeat. At the cost of only 2 killed and 27 wounded, Britain captured the island after a relatively brief fight. Chinese casualties are unknown, but they've been estimated at over 3,000. Unlike other officials, Yi Che did admit to the Emperor that he had suffered a defeat. However, he also claimed to have fought a force of over 50,000 British soldiers and inflicted huge casualties upon them. In reality, the British probably had about 3,000. They had been massively outnumbered. The British fleet was now heading towards its primary target, the wealthy and important city of Ningpo, at the mouth of the Yangtze River. While the Pearl River was essential for foreign trade, it was the Yangtze that was the true heart of China's economy and strength. In their way was one last city to be taken, Zhenhai. Still angry and humiliated over his defeat, Yu Che tried to rally his troops once again with fine words and impassioned rhetoric. However, it seems to have fallen flat. Even his own deputy begged to be relieved from duty, claiming he couldn't fight because his wife was ill. He had a sore foot, and even that a fortune teller had claimed it may rain. The resulting battle was another humiliation for Yi Che. His fort's guns couldn't even reach the British ships and were pounded into submission. In response, most of the Chinese defenders fled, while Yu Che's deputy raised the white flag and told his men to abandon their posts. A furious Yu Che ordered his own guns to fire on his fleeing soldiers, killing many. There remained but one force of 5,000 men to beat. Here, a clever strategy was used by the British commander. His force of 2,000 men was divided up into 3 units, with the first 2 hidden behind high ground. Seeing only a small force of British soldiers, Yu Che told his army to advance on their position. Lured into a killing zone, they were suddenly hit on both sides by sustained firepower. They collapsed and fled. The British lost only 16 dead and a few wounded. The Chinese had lost at least 700 and one of their key armories. Yu Che poisoned himself rather than face the emperor's displeasure. Ningpo, one of the great cities in the whole of the empire, then fell without a shot being fired. We will leave the British here for now in Ningpo. Join me next time as an increasingly flustered and angry emperor makes a horrific mistake, appointing a man who is a close contender for the worst general in all of China's long and ancient history. Expect incompetence, corruption, disaster, and attack monkeys. Yes, you heard that right, attack monkeys. See you next time for more Forgotten Wars.